الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. باب شروط الصلاة التي تتقدمها. Amongst some of the conditions like tahara, we discussed in more detail. And then we also talked about the awqat al-salah, the times of prayers, which is another necessary condition for salah. In this chapter, the Musannif rahimahullah ta'ala talks about the remaining conditions which are necessary in order for a salah to be considered valid. يجب على المصلي أن يقدم الطهارة من الأحداث والأنجاس على ما قدمناه. So first thing is that it's obligatory for a worshipper to give precedence to purity from both ritual and physical impurities, whether minor or major, like we've discussed them in Kitab al-Tahara. وَيَسْتُرُ عَوْرَتَهُ, and to conceal their awra, their nakedness. So the question to ask is, what is the awra? وَالْعَوْرَ مِنَ الرَّجُلِ مَا تَحْتَ السُّرَّةِ إِلَى الرَّكْبَةِ وَالرُّكْبَةُ عَوْرَةٌ دُونَ السُّرَّةِ. The nakedness or the awra of a man is whatever is below the navel to the knee. The knee is included in the awra, but the navel is not. وَبَدْنُ الْمَرْأَةِ الْحُرَّةِ كُلُّهُ عَوْرَةٌ إِلَّا وَجْهَهَا وَكَفَّيْهَا. All of the body of free woman is considered awra except for her face and her two hands. Although the word kaf means palms, but obviously it's difficult to conceptualize having your palms open without your hands. So the back of the hand is also included, even though the word does not itself support it. And some of the fuqaha from the Hanafi madhab, they say that the feet are also not part of the awra. So up till the ankle excluded, right? That's also not considered as part of the awra. وَمَا كَانَ عَوْرَةٌ مِّنَ الرَّجُلِ فَهُوَ عَوْرَةٌ مِّنَ الْأَمَةِ وَبَطْنُهَا وَظَهْرُهَا عَوْرَةٌ وَمَا سِوَى ذَلِكَ مِنْ بَدْنِهَا لَيْسَ بِعَوْرَةٍ. Now talking about a masala that does not really concern us in our times, but since he's mentioning it, we might as well discuss it. It's about a slave girl. So a man, if he's a slave, his awra is the same as a free man. But a slave girl or slave woman's awra is different from a free woman. And that is that her awra is the same as a free man, except that her belly and her back are also part of the awra. So which means her hands up to the shoulders, her chest, her head, her hair, none of that is included in the awra as it would be for a free woman. So it's the same as that of a man, except for two things, which are also part of the awra, not part of the awra in the man, which is her batnuha, her belly, wa dhahruha, and her back. Now, obviously, when saying that awra, covering the awra is a condition, we need to have some support. And so we find in Surah Al-A'raf, verse number 31, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, خُذُوا زِينَتُكُمْ عِنْدَ كُلِّ مَسْجِدٍ. That take your adornments whenever you want to pray. And by this, the fuqahas say that it means to actually cover your awra. Because zina, which some people might translate as fashion, it doesn't really fit. Because fashion is something that's very dynamic, it changes. So You need something which can actually be a tafsir applicable in all times to all people in all places, right? And so by zina in this ayah, we refer to clothes that cover a person's aura. Also in the hadith, it's mentioned that Asma radiallahu anha, uh, the sister of Aisha radiallahu anha, she came to the Prophet ﷺ. Her head was covered with uh, a scarf, but it was very transparent, right? And so the Prophet ﷺ told her, لا يقبل الله صلاة حائز إلا بخمار, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not accept the prayer of a grown woman unless her head is entirely covered, right? So we know that the acceptance of salah is dependent on her covering her head. In other words, covering her aura. So by this verse of the Quran and this hadith, we know that aura is a necessary condition which needs to be fulfilled. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ مَا يُزِيلُ بِهِ النَّجَاسَ صَلَّى مَعَهَا وَلَمْ يُعِدْ. Whoever does not find garments, whoever does not find something by which he can remove the physical impurity, either from their body, from their clothes, or for the place where they're worshipping, the ground or prayer mat. صلى then they can pray with the impurity, ولم يعد, and there is no need to repeat it. Right? And there are basically two scenarios in which this can build up. If 1/4 or more of a person's clothes, they're pure, just some part of it has become tainted with impurity, then that person must pray with those impure clothes on. And praying without clothes in this case is not allowed. But if less than 1/4 of the clothes are pure, then the most of the clothes, they've become tainted with impurity, less than 1/4 of the cloth has remained unscathed by the impurity. In that case, the Shaykhain say that a person has an option. They can either pray with the impure clothes on, or they can pray naked. And they prefer that a person prays with the clothes on, right? Because if most of your clothes are impure, you're not meeting the condition, right? But so wearing the clothes on and not wearing them in respect to the salah, they're literally the same. But it's still better to actually pray with those impure clothes on, because if you pray with them, you're only leaving out one fard, or one condition, which is the purification of the clothes. But if a person chooses to pray naked, then they're going to have to leave out a lot of furuz. For example, for a naked person, the method of prayer is to actually sit down with their feet extended towards the qibla to hide their aura as much as possible. So when you're praying sitting down, obviously you're leaving the farz of the qiyam, of standing. You can't make the ruku properly, so you're leaving the farz of the ruku. You can't make the sujood, you'll be leaving the farz of the sujood. So when praying naked, a person misses out on a lot of farz acts. So in order to avoid that, it is better to pray in those impure clothes. But still remember, if most of your clothes, more than 3/4, are impure, you still have an option of deciding whether to wear those clothes or whether to pray naked. And remember, covering the aura is not for the sake of other people only, which means that even if you're in a dark room in which you can't even see your own body, you still can't go fully naked and pray. You still have to cover yourself up. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ ثَوْبًا صَلَّى عُرْيَانًا, and whoever doesn't find any garments, then that person can pray naked قائدا seated يؤمي بالركوع والسجود, and then he will make gestures for ruku' and sujud, for bowing and prostration. Such a person can hide themselves like in a room with curtains drawn, gates locked, so nobody can enter. If such an environment is created, for example, then a person can actually pray as they would normally do. But if the environment is unsafe, anyone can pop out any moment, you're not 100% sure, then in that case, if no clothes are present, then a person should sit down and make gestures for the ruku and sujood. And I mentioned the position that your feet should be extended towards the qibla. So you have to try and hide your aura as much as possible. So the fuqaha give a scenario. For example, if someone is in murky water, they should submerge themselves as much as possible to cover as much aura of theirs as they can. So, so they have to submerge themselves in that murky water as much as they can to in order to cover as much aura as possible, and then pray by using isharatul ras, by indicating with their head, making gestures in order to perform the ruku and sujud. فَإِنْ صَلَّى قَائِمًا أَجْزَأَهُ. But if someone actually prays while standing, even if the environment's not safe, anyone could come in any moment. But it is better to perform it in the first method, that is by sitting down. Why? Because obviously this condition of covering the aura no longer applies because you don't have any clothes which you can wear. Either they're not available or more than 3/4 of your clothing has been tainted with impurity in both cases. So since that condition no longer applies, you have both options of praying standing and pray while sitting. But like I mentioned, if you pray while sitting, well, obviously, in the case of tainted clothes, the problem of leaving out a lot of furuz, a lot of farz acts, that's the problem. But in the case you have no clothes at all, it's better to sit down because in that case, you'll be covering your aura as much as possible. But then again, like I mentioned, if it's a safe environment with no chance of anybody coming up on you, then it would be better to actually pray normally while standing, because in this way, you'll be able to perform most of the first acts. Now, these were the conditions outside of prayer. The next one is the niyyah or the intention. وينوي للصلاة التي يدخل فيها بنية لا يفصل بينها وبين التحريم بعمل. It's also necessary for the musalli to make the intention of prayer which he's about to enter. And this intention should not separate from the tahrima. So when making the intention and when starting the prayer, there should be no action in between which is not part of the salah or which does not lead to the salah. So if you make the intention of praying, then you go to perform wudu, right? And then you start your prayer. So there is a gap. You are doing something in between the intention and in between the takbir tahrima, starting the prayer. But because this amal is part of the salah in the sense that it is a means to allow you to pray. So this kind of action is not a problem. But for example, if you made the intention of starting your prayers, then someone called you and then you were busy talking to them, or that you first thought that I should have dinner first, then you started having lunch there, and you were talking to that person, then you finished. You can't directly start the prayer, you have to make another intention. Because this time, the type of action that you did between the niyyah and between the tahrima, that is something which is entirely out of the scope of salah. Neither is it part of the salah nor it leads to the salah. So this kind of separation between your niyyah and your actual execution of the salah requires you to make a new intention. And remember that the niyyah is the action of the heart, which means even if by mistake you say something else, if you're making intention with your tongue, but your heart is, but in your heart, you know, with salah, you're actually praying, uh, it won't matter whatever your tongue says. You'll be fine. So if you intend to pray Dhuhr and you accidentally say Asr, the salah is acceptable because your intention, the action of your heart, was still Dhuhr. So the question is, we know niyyah is the fi'l qalb, but do we also have to say it out loud? I mean, do we have to use our tongues? Some ulama say that this is actually bid'ah, that it's not proven that the Prophet ﷺ or the Sahaba radiallahu anhum used to make intention by saying that I'm intending to pray as this and this salah, behind this and this imam, for example, and so on. You have to make uh, a mental note, a niyyah, that you're doing so. Other ulama suggest that if you're actually saying the niyyah out loud for the sake of being more mindful, then this is allowed. But if someone makes niyyahs thinking that it's actually very necessary and stuff like that, then this transforms it into a bid'ah, right? And always remember that the niyyah must be before you say the takbir tahrima. You cannot make the niyyah after you saying the takbir, because takbir is the start of the salah and the intention must precede the action. You can't make an intention after you've started it. ويستقبل القبلة إلا أن يكون خائفا فيصلي إلى أي جهة قدر. And one must face the qibla, except when they're in a state of fear. Then in that case, they may pray in any direction possible. So, for example, if the enemy is right in front of you on the battlefield, and they're, for example, in the opposite direction of the Qibla, now obviously, if the Muslim soldiers were to face towards the Qibla, they'd be attacked from the behind with no way to defend themselves. So, in such a case, a person can pray facing any direction which suits them. It's not just the enemy. For example, if you're being chased by a wild animal and you fear, you're on the lookout and you fear if you face the Qibla, you might get attacked from the behind. You can pray in any direction, which is possible. And also when you're traveling and praying Nafil Salah, right? If you're traveling and you're praying Nafil Salah, then in that case, and you're not traveling by foot, that's necessary to know. You're traveling on a vehicle and you're praying Nafil. You also don't have to face the Qibla. You can face any direction, which is easier. So these are three cases in which you are allowed not to face the Qibla. Other than that, it's necessary that you do face the Qibla, and it's a necessity dictated by the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse number 144. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, فَوَلُّوا وُجُوهَكُمْ شَطْرَةً, that turn your faces towards the Baytullah, towards the Kaaba. But obviously, like I mentioned, that this is for a person who's not in a state of fear. Now, the word qibla, it's actually the name of a condition in which a person faces something, right? So if I'm facing you, then you're the qibla, right? Or the state that I am when facing you is the qibla. But now the word qibla is basically used for the direction of the Kaaba, right? Another word used for it, usually within the mosque settings, we call the mihrab, right? The place or the arc which uh, depicts the direction of the qibla, right? And the word mihrab is actually from the word al-muharaba, which means to fight. So when you're praying, you're actually fighting your nafs and you're fighting the shaitan, right? When facing the qibla, when facing Kaaba. So that's why it's also known as the mihrab. Now for an important note. For a person performing a Farz prayer or a Sunnah prayer, uh, or a Nafil prayer in normal conditions, the traveling condition is an exception to that, or even if they're performing Sajdatul Tilawa or Salatul Janazah, right? And they have the ability to face the Qibla, but they purposefully do not face the Qibla and then go ahead and perform these acts of ibadah. Remember that without any udhur, without any excuse, if on purpose a person prays any kind of salah without facing the Qibla, then this action is tantamount to performing kufr. It's a very serious issue because when you've been commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to perform your prayers and all of these types of ibadat when facing the Kaaba, and a person deliberately chooses not to do that, to ignore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's orders, and not only that, and also basically pray in another direction, that's similar to saying that I reject this verse of the Quran, which is telling me to face towards the Qibla. And if you reject one verse of the Quran, that is the same as rejecting the entire Islam. And if you reject Islam, then obviously you can no longer be considered a Muslim. So again, to be very careful that a person who performs their salah when able, having no excuse, they don't face the Qibla, that is tantamount to kufr. Similarly, if for some reason you're in this may happen in Jummah or things like that. Uh, you're trapped in the saf, your wuzu broke, for example, right? And you can't, maybe it's really jam-packed or it's really long that you can't actually exit the mosque for some reason. Sit down at the very place that you were praying. You cannot imitate in praying the salah, right? Like with the other people. Because if you do so and you don't have an excuse, then again, you're rejecting the conditions set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that of achieving purity. So you have to be very careful in these things that first to make sure that you're performing all of the farz, meeting all of the conditions. And for some reason that it's not possible, and you don't have an excuse against it, then don't perform that act of ibadah, right? So be careful in this regards. Now, when talking about the Qibla, obviously if you are in Makkah, you're in the Haram, you have to face the building of the Kaaba. You have to make sure you face the building. But if you're in some other place, other city, other country, then you only have to face the direction of the Kaaba. You don't have to pinpoint exactly where it might lie. You just have to face the direction. So if where you are, it lies to the west, 30 degree, then you just have to face west 30 degree. It's very much possible that you might be off a few centimeters, but that's not what you're uh, asked to do because it'll be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to make sure that you're in Australia and you're actually facing the building of the Kaaba. So for the person inside of the haram, they had to face the building. For those outside, they just have to face the direction. And so the Qibla is not just the cubic building of the Kaaba itself. It actually goes up to the sky. So imagine a beam of light in that cubical form is going right up to the seventh heaven. So the entire thing is Qibla. And with that, if you ever go to the moon or Mars, if you're really interested, right, you know where to face. So it's going right up there. You just locate where the Kaaba would be on Earth and just face that direction. So even outer space, you can actually perform your prayer because the Qibla is actually possible to pinpoint. Maybe not 100%, but still get an idea of where the Qibla might be. Now a case where a person do not face the Qibla, yet their Salah is valid. فإن اشتبهت عليه القبلة وليس بحذر من يسأله عنها اجتهد وصلى. So if the Qibla is unclear to a person, right, and there's no one present who they can ask about it. So two things. If there's no one present at all, or if there are people, but they're not aware of the Qibla, maybe a non-Muslim community, or maybe they are a Muslim community as well, but they're new, so they're not accustomed to finding it. Maybe they're not new, but they don't know the geometrical calculations on how to find the Qibla. Any reason that you yourself don't know or people nearby have no idea how to. Ijtahada wa salla. Then what you can do is do your istihad. Try level best to find out where the Qibla lies. And whatever answer you come up with, whatever your decision is, you just pray in that direction. Right? So in the case you don't know, uh, the wajib on you now is actually to do the taharri. Taharri basically means trying your level best to find out what the answer is and then acting on it, right? Now you're in a place where there isn't anybody or you can't see anybody. Do you have to search for someone before you start? That's another question. Because he says, وَلَيْسَ بِحَزْرَتِهِ مَن يَسْأَلُهُ. There's no one present there. I no one present that you can see. So the fuqaha say that you can shout out, and if nobody hears you, right, then you make tahari. But if there are people, or you suspect that there might be people nearby, then you have to first shout out to be able to make sure that there's no one nearby. Maybe there is someone and they'll come to you, and maybe there's someone that you can actually ask about the Qibla. So you have to do your level best first to try out, to find out a method which can actually help you pinpoint the exact direction. If you fail in all aspects, then you do the tahari, the ijtihad to find the Qibla on your own. On this note, there's another question about using compasses, inbuilt compasses within our phones, the applications of finding the Kaaba and stuff. Uh, Obviously, this depends on the algorithm on which the application is built. So if it's been tested or verified by the ulama, then there's no problem in using it. Like if it's country specific, all the well, but if it's a general compass for for finding out where the direction of the Kaaba is. Be sure, make sure that the settings are done to find it in the right direction. So it's possible that in one country it lies in the east, in another it lies in this north. Maybe your application was set by default to tell you about the Kaaba in the east, but you travel to a country where it's in the north. You're looking at it and it's telling you the other direction. Right? So this is a problem that could occur. So make sure if you're using such an application, two things to make sure. First, its settings are according to the location you are at. And the first one was to make sure that it's been verified by scholars and by those who have expertise in this area. Right, but that's it. This moment, the masla we're discussing, you have none of these things. You have nobody you can ask. You don't have your devices with you either. You have to make an educated guess based on whatever you might be able to see there. فإن علم أنه أخطأ بعدما صلى فلا إعادة عليه. So if a person comes to know that they actually prayed in the wrong direction once they're done with their prayer, so maybe you prayed, uh, you went on a bit further, you realized that there's a mosque built and the direction of the mihrab was different from the direction in which you were praying. فلا لا إعادة, you don't have to repeat your salah, right? Because at the moment you were performing salah, your qibla was not this direction, it was the direction you were facing. So it's mentioned in the Quran, أَيْنَمَا تُوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. Wherever you face, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is present there, right? Allah is everywhere. Like, there's no fixed direction where He's present, but we only necessitate Qibla when it's possible, not because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, na'udhu billah, is in that specific place, specific direction, but for building cohesion and giving a sense of unity to the members of the Ummah. So in the case where you cannot detect where the Asl Qibla is, you're allowed to move away from it. And so for this person who did his ijtihad, he prayed, then realized that he was on mistake. There's no need for him to repeat. فإن علم ذلك وهو في الصلاة استدار إلى القبلة وبنى عليها. And if a person realizes that they're in the wrong when they're praying inside their prayer, they just change the direction towards the qibla and keep praying that prayer. You just build on it. You don't need to break your salah, start from new. And we find evidence for this in the hadith of Masjidul Qiblatayn, is that when the Prophet Islam he first came to Medina, for a certain time the Qibla was actually shifted to Jerusalem, to Bayt al-Maqdis. After 6 months or so, it was reverted back to the Kaaba. So when it reverted back to the Kaaba, the Prophet Islam sent messengers all across Medina to inform the people. So when one of his messengers reached the masjid, the people were already praying Asr. They were facing the Bayt al-Maqdis. And he informed them they didn't break off their prayer. Inside of their prayer, they shifted from Bayt al-Maqdis to Bayt al-Haram. And the Prophet Islam did not instruct them to repeat their prayers. So by this we know if a person, they made a mistake initially, but they're still praying. If they realize their mistake, either by themselves or someone tells them, they can basically just shift their direction without breaking off their original prayer. Right? This happens if they made the tahari, right? But what if someone does not make the tahari? They don't do the ijtihad to try and first find the qibla. what would be the case then? I mean, they did not complete the wajib, which was necessary on them. In this case, if a person prays and then they realize they actually, without the tahari, face the correct direction, because they unknowingly fulfill the condition, their prayer is acceptable. But if they realize that they faced the wrong direction, well, in this case, because they did not complete that which was wajib on them, they have to repeat their prayer, right? And also, if a person uh, was praying without the tahari, and then someone instructed them or told them that the direction is the other way around, they're going to have to break off their salah and then start anew. Because if they did tahari, they could just move inside of their salah. But in case they did not do tahari initially, they're going to have to break off their salah and then start anew. One more thing though. Say that at the start of it's now time for Zuhr, you don't know where the Qibla is. Do you make tahari instantly, just when you intend to pray, or should you delay your salah until the very end in hopes that you may find someone or some signs through which you can actually find the actual direction of the Qibla, right? So some ulama suggest that at the moment you're wanting to pray, the wajib on you is tahari, so there's no need to delay it. Others say that if you're hopeful that you might find someone who you can ask about the direction of the Qibla, then it is good that you delay. And they say that it's not necessary to delay, but it's good that you do delay if you're hopeful. And if you're not hopeful, then there's no point in delaying it. While a third party, they say that it's best that you delay in all cases, even if you're not hopeful, because not everything happens as you hope. So it's very possible you might stumble upon someone. So it's best to actually face the direction of the Kaaba, the original Qibla, whenever possible. So delay as much as you can. And if you don't find someone, then do the tahari and pray. Also, so tahari, like I mentioned, is to try your best to form an opinion in a direction which you pray. But what if someone does tahari, but they can't decide? They can't make a decision on where the Kaaba should lie, whether it's north, south, west, east. They're so confused they can't make a decision. What should happen then, right? Some say delay your salah until you can get to a decision. Others say that pray in all directions. So basically, you have to pray 4 times, right? So these two options. And this masala, the specific masala, in which your ijtihad, by through spending all of your mental capacity to find a qibla, you're still unable to, right? This could transpire in 3 cases. So either you are doubtful of what the qibla is, either you're not doubtful and you don't do tahari, right? So you think that the qibla is west and you pray west. You're not doubting your own decision, right? And so you don't do the new tahari. In this case, the salah is acceptable unless you realize that you've made a mistake. Second is you're doubtful, but you don't make tahari. You're doubtful that you're not facing the qibla. Your job was to make the tahari, but you choose not to. In this case, your salah is invalid unless you actually realize that you were facing the right direction. So say you're confused in which the direction is, but without doing tahari, you choose to pray towards the east, right? So the hukum for your salah at this moment is that it is invalid. But later you realize that it actually was the east, the qibla was the east, then your salah will be acceptable because unknowingly you faced the right direction. That's the second case. Third case is that you're doubtful, you have the shak, and you also do tahari. So that was a masala that we discussed right now, that if you realize that you made a mistake after you're done with your salah, you don't have to repeat it. But if you realize your mistake inside the salah, you just turn around, right? Now, these were the conditions of salah. Number one, we talked about tahara. Number two was satr al-awra, covering of the awra. Number three was intention, making niyyah. Number four was actually number four was istiqbal al-qibla, facing the qibla, right? So these were the four conditions discussed in this chapter. Now you might have realized that when mentioning each condition, the Musannif also mentioned mas'ala, also mentioned a case in which these conditions were not being found. For example, he mentioned that you must be pure from najasa, but then he mentions the masala that if you find nothing but clothes tainted with the impurity, you're allowed to pray in them, right? He mentioned the masala in which you have to cover your aura, but then he mentioned a case in which if you don't find clothes at all, neither your own, neither some that you could borrow from another person, and you also find no other means, maybe a sheet or something to wrap yourself around, whatever the case, completely naked, then you can sit down and pray. And the last masala that we discussed, that facing the qibla is a necessary condition, but if someone cannot find it and they do tahari, then their salah is also acceptable. So by mentioning these cases, what the Musannif is basically trying to tell us is that although these are conditions for the salah, but if an excuse occurs, then you can leave out the conditions and your prayer will still be valid. So that is the difference between a condition for salah and actually being a component of the salah. A salah without its arkan, without its components, is not a salah. So there's no excuse for leaving any of them out. But conditions, in special cases, might be excused. So remember, whenever we say the word fard when talking about salah, there are some fards which are actually the conditions, and there are some fards which are actually the components of the salah. Components include, the next chapter is all about the components. Includes the qiyam, the qira'ah, the ruku, the sujood, the taslim, right? So these are the components of the salah. For example, you can't have a salah without the sujood. Maybe you're unable, you get a substitute by actually making gestures of performing the sajda. So a substitute is present, but the essence of the action can never be erased. Right? So that difference between farz and between arkan. Why I'm telling you this is that in the book that we're discussing, Mukhtasar Quduri, he separated the two things. He mentions shurut salat in a different chapter and sifat salah in a different chapter. But there are many books which actually form just one chapter, and they call it Babu Furuz salah, the chapter on the fara'is of salah. the obligations of Salah. And in that same chapter, they include both things. They include the conditions that we've just discussed, and they also include the components, right? So yes, they're all farz, but they're not all farz of the same level. Conditions can be let go of in specific cases, but components cannot be left off in any case. So this is distinction is a good thing to remember, because if you choose to go on to study some other text, you must keep this difference between a component and a difference between a condition in mind.